Bilgewater is dead, and with that, a lot of people are currently lost on how to approach the B patch for 1318 after Set 9.5's launch. If you're not climbing, it's likely because you're not rerolling enough. Currently, the way to win, get a 3-star on your board of some kind. I've gathered the top reroll compositions and how to play them. Let's get straight into it. Let me start where we left off in the previous video. Cho Bidem Bruiser reroll. Cho is actually much better as a pure tank. Before, I recommended putting something like Spark on him so you can get more magic damage with Malzahar, but in reality, you usually put 3 full defensive tank items on him like Redemption, Bramble, Dragon's Claw, and you give AP items to Malzahar through Blue Buff, Death Cap. You don't really often get to pick the AP items you put on Malzahar, so you just have to kind of go for whatever you can get. If you need AP Shred, a lot of times you end up playing things like a Shiv on Silco or whatever backliner you play. And if you do get a +1 bruiser, a lot of times you end up just putting it on one of your backliners to get 6 bruiser ASAP. A lot of things that I want to focus on is, one, you don't need to actually hit anything besides Cho 3. A lot of times when you play Chogath reroll, people are obsessed with hitting, the Renekton 3 and maybe going for Vi 3 and Malzahar 3. And while those are really nice, the only unit that kind of really matters is Chogath. So if you're in a situation where you hit Chogath 3 and then you don't have a lot of copies of Renekton or Malzahar, just push levels and get to that 6 bruiser as fast as you can, and then flex around whatever units you do to end up hitting. So for example, let's say instead of Malzahar and Silco, you end up saying find a good opportunity to play around Kai'Sa, and then you can tech in Fiora, and all of a sudden now you're playing Kai'Sa Fiora with challengers as your additional DPS to go alongside Chogath. Remember, Chogath is a tank that can deal damage. He's not your primary damage dealer. So in a lot of cases, you need to have someone else ready to go to help add that support DPS. Otherwise, you're going to get overwhelmed in the late game by comps that do have enough DPS to take you down. Because in the end, bruisers are about stat checking your opponents. You have so much HP and resistances through things like the +1 bruiser, or if you get unified resistance, it's really, really hard to get through. But for anybody that has the 2-star units and they have a lot of AoE and burn and other ways to get through high HP like Giant Slayer, you're going to be in trouble if you don't actually have the DPS. In terms of the augments, there's 2 things I want to really shout out. 1, Trade Sector is extremely good with Lee Sin, and right now a lot of people want to play Lee Sin, as we talked about in the intro, to make sure that you get a bunch of opportunities to reroll quickly. The second is Pandora's Bench. This is another way for you to effectively re-roll by using parts of your bench to get an opportunity to transform them into the same champions. But the way you play it is hold a lot of your 1-cost pairs, so that way those things like those Irelias or those random Alawis can turn into 2-star units. Then you put them onto the bench to transform them potentially into Chogath, Renekton, Malzahar, Cassiopeia, whatever variation you want to play. Speaking of, there's another variation that we talked about previously that goes around Shurima with Cassiopeia. You can play Cassiopeia and link to Shurima if you're able to find a Shurima emblem and play that on Chogath. In this case, you would probably replace something like the Dragon's Claw and play the Shurima. Go for a +1. In this case, you would go for probably the Azir and then flex around that. So if you have a +1 bruiser, probably take things out like the Vi, and then you instead go for either vertical Shurima or you lean into whatever else you're hitting, like strategist. The nice thing about Cassiopeia is that she's actually almost a 1-to-1 replacement to Malzahar. She can basically hold the exact same items if you go for the 3-star, and you're good to go. Another variation that you can play is actually around Milio and going for a really good Ishtal. If the Ishtal is wood, which gives you scaling HP, that's actually very good for Chogath to get that HP. So we go back to playing the Dragon's Claw variation, and you go for the Ishtal with probably the Nico in this spot. You get Nico in, and then you have an opportunity to play around the Bastion with Taric. And because you have this, you can go into Silco instead for your Sorcerer, and you can kind of play around this. Usually you don't do this unless you get a +1, so you're probably cutting the Renekton, or let's just say you don't hit Scion for now. And then if you do hit Bruiser, make sure you give Bruiser to one of these really important frontline units like the Taric. Another thing I want to shout out is that some of these comps can also use Pandora's items really well. So let's say you don't really like playing Lee Sin, but you love playing Twisted Fate. You can also use Twisted Fate to guarantee these best in slot items. The Ornn artifacts that are really good with Cho are things like Anima Visage and Death Defiance. Anima Visage gives you HP percentage heal per second, and if you have thousands of HP, that's a lot of health to shoot through quickly. And then Death Defiance defers the damage and deals it over 4 seconds, giving you time to heal it back. So if you're able to even somehow get both of these items, I'm not sure exactly how, but let's say you open up Portable Forge and then something crazy happens with Ornn's Forge in the portal and you get 2 of these, you will have an unkillable Chogath. So make sure to stack these items on him. In terms of how you actually build up to this comp, it's pretty straightforward to what we talked about before, and you'll notice a general theme across a lot of one cost rerolls, which is you try to prioritize your gold and economy first before you actually end up trying to win. A lot of times you end up playing like a pair of Chos and maybe a single Malzahar so that you can make 10 gold at 2-1. Or maybe you sell this Malzahar entirely and you just play a Cho 2-star with a single Cho, and then you're actually finding the way to make that interest goal and get to 50 quickly. That being said, be careful about selling things like Vernekton and Malzahar too much, otherwise you shut the door basically on whether or not you can hit them quickly, and then you have to move on without them. But the core units are pretty straightforward here in this spot, so you end up going for Vi. A lot of times you do want to play for Rek'Sai, but because she's a 3 cost, it's harder to hit. A lot of times you end up playing like a cheaper void like Kassadin, so you play something like this until you're able to hit Rek'Sai. And then from here, you pretty much just systematically add a little bit more bruisers or add another sorcerer. So let's say you do hit the Chogath 3 pretty quickly, and now you have this at level 5. At level 6, you can add a different sorcerer unit. So let's just play a Velkoz and just make our Void Remore a little bit stronger. And then at 7, we find Sejuani. If you have a +1 bruiser, you get the 6 bruiser that way. And then you replace Velkoz with Silco, give the items to Malzahar or Silco, depending on whoever your carry is. I didn't actually mention about positioning, but the one thing you want to make sure is that with Chogath having things like Redemption, that he's sandwiched between 2 bruisers that are durable, you don't actually want Chogath to be isolated pretty quickly. Otherwise, he's going to get feasted on and targeted by units. Putting him in the middle ends up making him a little bit less vulnerable to things in the corner. If your opponent's playing things like, I'm just going to put this Kale here, for example. If this Kale is here, she's going to target the Renekton. You can sometimes put Chogath to intercept it if it makes sense for the matchup. But if it's a really high burst DPS unit, especially if they're playing, an item that has a lot of power like a Deathfire Grasp that nukes tanks in particular, Deathfire Grasp blasts the current damage for 20% of their max HP. So make sure these kinds of units are not in front of Chogath. Otherwise, you're going to lose a huge part of your HP, which is defeats the whole purpose of why we got all those stacks. If you're wondering why reroll is so good right now, here are 3 reasons in my opinion. 1, the stats are just good on them. They buff Chogath a lot on PB, for example, so when you just buff them enough, they just become good. 2, there's a lot of new portals that actually support reroll type playstyles. You're looking at Rat Town and Slaughter Docks, even Ishauken or Iwaken. How the hell do you pronounce that portal? I have no idea. These are all really good portals for you to pick, and a lot of people end up rerolling on them, so you want to do that. And 3, perhaps the most important concept to understand, the more people reroll, the better reroll gets. That's because they're pulling more units out of that pool that are in the similar tier, making you more likely to hit. So if someone's going for a 1-cost reroll, you should also be considering 1-cost reroll. If 3 people are going for it, if you find uncontested 1-cost, you'll be very likely to hit and be able to keep up with the tempo of the lobby. And so if you end up being the 1 or 2 people that aren't rerolling in the lobby, you fall really far behind because everyone else hits so much quicker and you have that less time in order to hit your 4 costs that you're looking for. Samira reroll is back, and this time you're going to be pairing Samira primarily with 2 champions, which is a Swain 3 and a Neferi 3. You can actually go Cassiopeia 3 as well in this build, so I'm just going to go ahead and 3-star her, but she's not that important. The number 1 priority is to play around Samira and get her some of her most powerful items, things like Blue Buff and Giant Slayer. You can put Deathblade, you can put Last Whisper, you can put Gunblade. In fact, there's so many different items that you can put on Samira. The reason why Neferi is actually pretty good is because if you're able to get a Noxus emblem onto Neferi in particular, the stats that you get are ridiculous. And also that Darkened Dagger, after casting, summon pack mates that attack the first enemy hit. That's really powerful in the Noxus interaction, specifically if you somehow get Neferi locked onto Samira. So keep in mind that if you're able to get this combination, it is disgusting. If you do get a +1 of some kind, you probably cut Katarina of all of them because she doesn't really need to be in the composition to deal damage. And then instead, you can go for Aatrox at the very top end to get double Darken and tie in the Juggernauts with Darius. Keep in mind, by the way, that you cannot get Aatrox and Neferi buff on the same person. So if for some reason you're able to do like, Aatrox and Neferi die, you can't double buff Samira. So generally you keep them on opposite ends instead. The augments I want to shout out are Total Domination, which is just really good, as well as a Noxus Crest. Scope Weapons is really interesting in particular because that's one way you can almost guarantee that the buff goes into Samira if Neferi dies. You do something like give Mordekaiser Scope Weapons, give him that RFC, and then Neferi ends up being really powerful to deal a bunch of active damage. And then when Neferi dies, she buffs the Samira as well. And as you can see, with positioning, it's pretty flexible. A lot of times in the early game, and I'll show you in the build-up, you end up having a Swain that holds things like the Stoneplate Gargoyle. You end up doing a kind of a backline positioning or like a staggered checkered back 2-row positioning, so that way Swain gets targeted. And this is because Swain is going to be the one that's often getting the Neferi buff early on, so getting that extra cast and that extra health is going to be really, really nice for him. Legend right now that I recommend is, surprise, surprise, Ornn, because Ornn has insane power with things like Sniper's Focus on Samira, which is really good, gives you that range extension, which also is good on Mordekaiser, by the way. You can also go Trickster's Glass on Samira and therefore get another Samira 3, which is obnoxiously good, even though you can't reduce it down to negative armor. Still very powerful. Another really strong thing is Death's Defiance, believe it or not, which is a really powerful way to keep Samira in the fight, and also just the raw stats on Death's Defiance gives her attack damage and attack speed. And then you can also do Gold Collector, which is just really powerful for her to farm gold early and then snowball your lead that way. A lot of times when you actually play Samira too, you might notice that in my party list, I don't actually have things like Lose Streak and Focus on Your Economy. You end up winning a lot of rounds because you have Samira too, and Nox is just high tempo. And don't forget that Noxus still wants the domination stats, meaning that every opponent you beat, you get a little bit stronger version of that Noxus trait. So it's actually good sometimes to win early game. And don't forget, by the way, that Swain also really loves certain items. So Anima Visage is probably just Swain's best item. And then you can also go for Eternal Winter. Even the Hull Crusher is also particularly really good. If you somehow get, you know, all these items onto Swain, he will be immortal and you will easily cruise to a top 4 or better. In terms of the buildup, a lot of times you just play Samira plus Cassio and Swain. This is the golden trio that you're looking for. And the fourth unit you play is Neferi. And then you end up playing these core 4 units for a little bit of time until you hit 5, which you would inevitably tech in ideally Darius, although you could probably play Katarina as well if you hit that. And this is where the Noxus Emblem really comes in handy, because the Noxus Emblem in particular lets you play 5 Noxus on 5 with Neferi and get a bunch of stats. Ends up being quite strong. From here, it's pretty straightforward. You can add in a bunch of different units. So let's say you're playing that Darius, you can just tech in another Juggernaut like Nautilus and just get a little bit more CC and durability. I've also seen people play things like a random support unit that can help keep the Swain alive, like a Soraka, because she can heal that Swain for a long time, keep him in the fight, and let your Samira and Cassio do a lot of work. And then at 7, you find Mordekaiser, try to play some items on him, and then get the 7 Noxus in ASAP. At this point, it's kind of hard to justify just like a pure solo frontline sometimes, so it's totally understandable if you want to do like Darius here with Katarina and Mord on the other side. And then at 8, if you can find Scion, that'd be fantastic. Cut that Katarina in this case. Play whatever legendary you want, whether it's Heimerdinger, or you find that Aatrox, which is pretty crazy. Or even if you do something kind of cool like a Rise, because Rise is an invoker that ties with Cassiopeia, and there's still some really powerful Rises. In particular, the Rise that I love the most with this is Noxus Rise, which is really funny because it's a Noxus comp, but if you do get Noxus trait Rise, it ends up being super powerful, giving you a bunch of weapons on a bunch of units that are overstatted. It's going to be a good time. I will say that giving Cassio items is not bad. You also can just give her things like Blue Buff and Giant Slayer and who knows, like maybe even a Gunblade. It's totally fine. Also, I want to give a shout out to one particular augment that I actually found success with myself, which is What the Forge. What the Forge is actually really interesting in this comp because across all the different champions, you actually have someone that can hold all these artifacts. Frontline items go on Swain. You can do things like Eternal Winter, Anima Visage, and the Hull Crusher. We mentioned that the Gold Collector, the Sniper's Focus, Trickster's Glass is really good on Samira. Death's Defiance is also really good on Samira. We can put on Neferi in this kind of spot. Mordekaiser has the ability to utilize things like Zonia's Paradox, Sniper's Focus, and DFG, which is also totally okay. Also, DFG can just also totally go on Cassio as well, and Manazane can also be put under her. Anybody can use Infinity Force. You can kind of see that you pretty much have a justification for any variation of items. The 2 worst tends to be DFG and Goldmancer, but at the same time, that's exactly what happened to me, and it ended up being an easy first place. The next comp I want to talk about is Reroll Jayce and Jinx. No longer is Jayce just a pilt over synergy bot that helps support the the other star gunners like Aphelios and Gangplank in this set, Jayce can actually primary carry, but you also want to play around Jinx as your primary because she's easy to get online, and she's actually surprisingly really good with almost any variation of the Zon mods. When you look at Jinx, her itemization is actually really flexible, but there's two items that people really prioritize really often, which is Rage Blade and that Runaan's Hurricane. You can actually justify a lot of different items. I've seen a lot of people actually not play Rage Blade and not even play Last Whisper if they have things like the Even Shroud on their frontliner. Instead, they go for things like a Giant Slayer and even like a Gunblade. That's even entirely possible depending on what you're hitting. The most important thing is that you do actually keep your tempo up, and this is actually a rare reroll composition where you actually want to play from almost ahead. I wrote down the priority list number one is get Piltover, and there's actually two ways that you can play it. You can play the traditional Piltover way, which is lose Shriek with Echo Jayce, Orianna, hold Jinx on your bench, try to like go for a big cash out and like start stabilizing around 3-5 to end of stage 3. The other is to actually just try to play Piltover and use it kind of like Astrals or Yordles from different sets where you get drip economy, meaning every single turn you get 1 or 2 gold. If you lose 2 rounds and then you win right afterwards, you get 4 gold or whatever to make it up. That's totally fine. And so you can actually play Jinx and Jayce just having higher economy and then re-rolling the 3-star almost everything. In that spot, you actually 3-star Vi, you sometimes 3-star Echo, and then you also 3-star Jayce, and you play around these units, which brings us to our augment that I want to highlight specifically, Shimmering Inventors. Your Piltover units deal more damage for every 10 gold you have, and you also gain an Echo. So this is actually a really powerful augment, not just for the Piltover opportunity, but also for the chance that your Piltover units like Jayce and Echo and Vi will actually do a lot of damage. If you do end up playing that situation, try to put some of these items on a Vi 3 and watch the magic happen. The other gunner augments are also stellar for this. If you get dueling gunners early, it actually is fantastic for jump starting your early game, so you can just play that win streak that we talked about. And then Gunner Heart is really good because it helps you get to 6 gunner if you can tech in everything that I show you, which is Graves, Aphelios, and Gangplank. A lot of times you're just going to play 4, and then 6 is probably what you play at the very end of the game to help get you from a top 4 to a top 2 and maybe a first. I will say one thing, which is people are like scared to really tech in Piltover late into the game. They think, wait, Piltover is like a stage 2 thing that you play. You don't actually play it, stage 3 or even stage 4. I've teched it as late as stage 4 before, and actually just played the rest of the game because I knew I was going to go for Echo 3 and Vi 3 because I had some augments that really supported it. So don't worry too much about it. It ends up being very good. It just as a way to support your game. As for Jayce items, it's pretty similar as well. It's very generically the same. You can justify instead of, having a Deathblade. Deathblade is a lot weaker because you have so much flat AD sources from Gunner. Deathblade is basically the Gunner trait, so you don't actually need 2 of those. Instead, you can just amplify it through attack speed because the more you attack, the more you get your Deathblades. So you can put Rage Blade on Jayce, you can put Runaan's, you can put Giant Slayers. So I'm showing you basically an entire suite of things you can put on your gunners for the most part. Positioning wise, people tend to always keep Jayce and Jinx right next to each other because Jayce buffs the Jinx with the attack speed, and so you're able to get a lot of burst. In some late game situations, sometimes I do like tricky things where I put like Jayce next to the gunners that don't matter nearly as much. If the opponent has like an enemy Jarvan, let's say Jarvan is sitting right here and you play Jayce, Jarvan's about to jump and really ruin your day, which can definitely mess up a lot of fights. Sometimes I end up putting Jayce and Jinx to a 3-star on opposite corners, so Jarvan has to choose one or the other. And in this case, I probably even move Gangplank towards the center, so that way it makes it a little bit more ambiguous where he's going to jump. And then in terms of the top end, don't be afraid to just like play good legendaries like Sion over Sejuani, and then Aatrox is just always good. And I will also say that if you ever get a +1 gunner emblem, Bel'Veth with gunner emblem is actually kind of insane. If you ever get this on her with the usual stuff like a Rage Blade and an Edge of Night, like so, this Bel'Veth too can out damage everybody in her team. She's actually really, really strong if you get that going. The legend I recommend to play this with is probably either Poro, so you can get like a lot of these different options, or Ornn, because there's so many good Ornn items. If you were to calculate them all, it's like Sniper's Focus is really good. You can also get things like Gold Collector, which ends up being quite solid to get that early game economy going. I also want to shout out 2 support items. The first is going to be fairly obvious, which is Zeke's. You can put Zeke's on any unit. I'm just going to put it on Gangplank here. And remember, the thing about Zeke's is that it's changed from the previous set because it's a support item, and now it affects 2 hexes. You can actually do something like this, and Gangplank's Zeke's will be buffing Bel'Veth and Aphelios, Jayce, and the Jinx. So Zeke's is actually really good if you're able to get it in this comp. The other I want to highlight is Banshees. Because you always tend to put things like the Jayce next to the Jinx, you could just theoretically put Banshee's Veil onto Jayce, and it grants ally immunity to any CC to the left and right by 1 hex. That ends up being really strong because we talked about the enemy Jarvan or other big AoE CC. it won't affect these units anymore. So you can sack one really powerful item and then put instead on Jayce, and then Jayce will instead buff the Aphelios and Jinx, and then you put a little bit more damage items onto Aphelios instead. In terms of the build-up, a lot of people play like an early Piltover strategy, kind of like this, where they put Vi and the T-Hex behind it, and it actually kind of makes sense, right? Because Vi is a melee unit, and T-Hex has 2 range, and so you want to put in the second row, and then Jayce and Orianna are backliners with 4 hex range, so you just kind of keep it like this. But surprisingly, this is actually a unit that can actually win a couple of fights in stage 2, especially if people are doing like, you know, only a Cho pair, and that's all they play. So how do you actually find a way to guarantee that you could potentially lose if you're up against even numbers? Well, here's one thing you can do. You can put Vi in the corner and trap her with Jayce and Orianna in the C7 and D6 hex. And what this does is, by moving the T hex up here, this Vi cannot leave because she's a melee unit and needs to walk up, so she's not going to interact until Orianna or Jayce die. In this case, you're actually fighting 2-on-2 or 3-on-2, and you'll guarantee to lose in those kinds of situations. I will say one thing, it's important that you don't put a unit like here in the top left, because let's go ahead and look at this board. Let's say theoretically your opponent is playing something like Casio and Chogath. If you put the TX here, these units do not move, and a lot of times these units might walk up 1 hex to attack, which frees the Vi. And so what you want to do is put this TX on the top of the vertical of the corner, so that way these units are incentivized to walk up and try to attack. From here, if you're trying to go for a big cash out, that's pretty self-explanatory. Basically, you just sell this Orianna and then you play the Echo instead, like so, and then you add in Jinx. A lot of times you hold a random Graves as well to try to get that 4 gunner. Let's say you're playing that gunner heart, and then this is like a board you could play at 5+1 with any kind of bruiser, so you can just take in a Renekton, for example. And then positioning is just kind of keep it generic, like openly spaced. And then at 7, you go for an upgrade on your Renekton, so you probably end up going for Sejuani if you can. A lot of times people play like Rek'Sai even as well. I want to give a shout out to, like, if you hit an early Aphelios, you can actually play the Targon Bastion version of it. So you play Taric and Shen. And in this case, you're probably not going to play this Grave. So you end up playing like Piltover at 7 with units like this. If you have a +1 gunner, you get that 4 gunner. You can also play just 3 gunner, by the way. Totally don't have to force 4 gunner if it doesn't really make sense, because you're like, oh, I have 4 gunner, and do I take out like Shen Taric? I don't want to take out my Piltover. Just play 3 gunner until you get 4. And then level 8, if you can find Gangplank, that's great. If not, you can always just play like another solid support unit that gives you a lot of high impact. So you could play, for example, a Jarvan. Jarvan just jumps to the back line and dunks and just gets a bunch of CC. The other unit I want to call out is Silco, because Silco's a Zon unit and he's a sorcerer. So you're like, hey, I dropped a bunch of tears and rods off my Piltover cash out, or, you know, a bunch of portal stuff. What do I do with it? All these are AD champions. Give the AP items to Silco and just watch him do a lot of damage. And you might as well, in these kinds of situations, by the way, go for that 4th Zon, so you can just check in, overcharge it. You get things like BioWare, which is really strong for Silco, and Robotic Arm, which is really good for Jinx. These are the 2 best mods that you can play, but if you get Shimmer Injector for Jinx, that's also playable. Also, I've seen some Adaptive Implant, which is also pretty solid. It is important to note that you can't get both Virulent and all of these things because of the way that it's staggered. In Zon mods, you only get offensive items at the very beginning, so you get things like Robotic Arm or Shimmer Inject, and then for Zon 4, you always get something defensive or a hybrid, so you get something like Hex, like Exoskeleton, which you could probably put on like Echo, for example. In general, this is one of my favorite reroll comps, so definitely give it a try. It's very, very fun and very strong. Well. Rogues are indeed very, very good, and they have survived the nerfs, despite the fact that a lot of them got chunked, like Kiana, for example, just lost a straight up Hex on some of her Radius stuff. They're still highly impactful and very tilting to go up against. So go ahead and play Rogues if you love backline access, but more importantly, making your opponents type something in all chat. There's a few different variations of Rogues. Let me show you some of the most common. The first is playing around Graves reroll, but this time, because Bilgewater's gotten nerfed and not as important, you actually don't play nearly as much around Graves, and you usually play around the powerful Ishtals like we talked about in the previous video. Nico and Milio just ends up being really good support units in the early game as well as the mid game. You can tech them out if you end up having less use of the Ishtal hexes. That kind of depends game to game. The best 3 Ishtals, in my opinion, to play Rogues are Stone, so you get the anti-CC, kind of like a Quicksilver on your Rogues. Ice, so you get the untargetable and the heal, kind of like a Zhonya's Paradox. And then 3 is Wood, so you can get a stacking amount of HP and get that Graves with BT Titans, high HP, making him very difficult to deal with, So it's kind of like a tank bruiser that's assassinating the backline carry. The other variation that we can talk about is to play Ishto with Qiyana. And in this case, you end up playing Qiyana carry and you end up tying her a lot of times with Echo and Katarina. And so you end up playing a very powerful variation where you're not chasing Graves necessarily. A lot of times you actually end up dropping Graves and playing something like Mordekaiser and giving him a rogue emblem, which actually ends up being kind of okay if you end up having Morg to the back line and then you play around Noxus with Katarina. So let's say you play Scion here. The other variation that you can play with Qiyana is to just go Nico with rogues, and then you just kind of play a little package around here, and then you give Nico really strong items that synergize with her kit, like Spark and that Crown Guard. And don't forget, chase Nico 3. My priority list here says Econ and Gold Focus. So you still want to lose streak early, which I'll show you in the build up in a little bit. But the most important thing is that you have to roll really hard to stabilize and get 4 rogues online ASAP. And so this is a variation that you'll see pretty often, but one I want to highlight that I put into the augments is Double Trouble. The other variation I want to highlight is Double Trouble, which if you get at 2-1, you can commit to reroll rogues, and you have a couple of variations that you can play within that too. You could roll at 5 for Graves 3, and then go for Graves 3 and add the other rogues. Or you can go to 6, roll down at 3-2, get a couple of rogues to just stabilize, and then get to 7 to eventually play things like Graves, Qiyana, Echo, Katarina. If you do end up playing for like a level 7 board, the unit you end up not going for is Graves because you're not rolling for him at level 5 instead. So you end up playing a board kind of like this, and you just end up lining up and having a field day and watching your opponents scramble as they deal with an amazing amount of backline access. I will say one thing, which is positioning does kind of matter because 2 of your rogues are AD and 2 of them are AP oriented. Have the Katarina with the Spark, or whoever has the Spark, maybe sometimes it's Echo. Have them be close to the other AP damage dealing sources, and then have the AD units next to each other. So if you end up having, Graves, for example, instead of this Gauge, is playing something like Even Shroud, which is the anti-armor trait, you can go ahead and put Graves next to Qiyana. The last variation that I'll show you before we do the other usual stuff is the Zaun version, which you can actually play around reroll Jinx. This is a variation where you're chasing 3-star Jinx, playing around something like Robotic Arm on her, which is really powerful, tying it the Zaun with Echo, and you have the Gunner through Graves as well. And so you basically roll this plus maybe an Ishtal, and it can actually be quite strong, especially if you give Jinx items as well. So you give her things like the Runins and that Rage Blade, and instead you're not really itemizing like Qiyana and Katarina. Maybe you're just going for Jinx 3, Graves 3, Echo 3, something like that, and you can actually play this to have a lot of success. And at level 7 in this instance, you would actually end up going for Nico and then finding a way to get a lot of value off of that. So as you can see, there's a handful of ways that you can play the rogue stuff, which makes them even more frustrating to deal with because that means 2, sometimes even 3 rogue players can all find success in their own ways if they specialize. You have one person going for Graves, you have another person going for like Echo and Jinx, and then you have a third person going for Qiyana and Katarina. It is just a nightmare. They really need to do something about this rogue trait because the big power spike is for rogue because they add that bleed. If you're playing 2 or 3 rogues, you're going to struggle to deal damage. It's only when you get that 4th rogue in is when you really start to pop off. I will say, by the way, before I go into build up, I forgot to talk about Augment, which is Jeweled Lotus is actually really good in rogues because every rogue wants an Infinity Edge or a Jewel Gauntlet put onto them. So you basically don't have to do that, and you get a 4th item in all your powerful rogues so they can get that big damage and crit everything. Okay, let's talk about build up. So a lot of times you have to do something like this where it's like Graves and you lose streak and you try to hold on to it. This is actually a really common way to build up, whether you're rolling for Graves at 5, 6 for Qiyana, or 7 for Cat and Echo. You kind of just open up to make sure you have a lot of gold because you want to lose streak early to go for a big spike in stage 3. If you play Graves and Qiyana, that's totally fine, but remember, don't be too strong to win. You want to lose the entirety of stage 2. Or if you do win, just make sure you have a lot of econ. The one thing I will say is that it's actually really easy to lose to Krugs when you play this comp, so just be careful. I actually lost to Krugs when I was playing in the box boot camp. I still managed to somehow pull out a top 4 by the skin of my teeth, but man, that was embarrassing to do on stream. Don't be like me. A lot of times you end up playing something like this to try and beat the Krugs. You can even take out the Milio, for example, if it's not that powerful, and just play like a Bilge Water. It's like, this is a variation that you could potentially play. But then you're really quick to sell them. You don't really want to commit to making 2-star things like Twisted Fate and whatnot because it ends up eating some of your economy a little bit. At level 6, you just roll really hard to hit Katarina, and you hit Echo and maybe like a Warwick or like a Jinx, and then play around that Milio, which you end up finding a way to get that Ishtal. And this is like the core units that you end up rolling for a lot of times, although sometimes instead of Jinx, you hit that Nico instead and you play around that Nico. At level 7, you have options. If the Ishtal is not very good, let's say it's like electric or wind that's not particularly super good, you can just tech in things like the Darius as well as, you know, like a Samira or a Cassio, like whatever you want to do. Cassio ties in Invoker, for example, and you can go this for Emilio. Not that important, but it's all different things you can do. And then slowly but surely, make sure to get that Morden ASAP, because the most important thing about Mord is that he's a Slayer that ties in with Kiana, and then you want to make sure you position accordingly. We also didn't talk about Ornn items, but Ornn is not particularly super common when you play rogues because there's only really one item that you care about, which is Death Defiance, which ends up being very good. You could do Infinity Force, actually pretty good on almost all the rogues. Last thing I will say is I do think that things like Zhonya's can be pretty strong, especially on units like Echo or Katarina that are AP based. Actually, a bonus tip is that if you are playing Double Trouble, if you take Trickster's Glass, it ends up counting for Double Trouble. So if you take Trickster's Glass and put on Echo, for example, you get a second Echo. That Echo, both of these get Double Trouble. But if you play another Echo, it actually disables all of it. So make sure if you do go for Double Trouble, do not actually play that extra copy. I also will say that Banshee's Veil is particularly very good in things like Rogue because it stops the CC for support, as well as things like Zeke's, Alice, Locket. Support cash in general is actually quite good in this comp. Even Zephyrs can be really obnoxious if you Zephyr the corner because that way they're not targeting nearly as much, but be careful that sometimes it means that they won't jump nearly as fast to the corners, and sometimes you want to assassinate them. The last of the common rerolls that you'll be seeing a lot on ladder is played around sorcerers and specifically around Velkoz. Velkoz currently is the best 3-cost reroll that isn't rogue oriented right now, and so a lot of times you want to actually play Velkoz from ahead and win streak because you're usually tempoing through early voids into sorcerers and then using your extra HP lead to roll slowly at level 7 for Velkoz 3. This is usually enabled by two things, which is getting something like a sorcerer emblem or getting a +1 on sorcerer heart, so that way you can get 6 Sork very quickly. And the most important thing is getting level 6 and getting 6 Sorks online. Second would be to get a lot of economy in some kind, so a portal that enables it, or you're playing a legend that gives you a lot of gold, definitely chase it. I will say in terms of legends though, one legend that's really good is Master E with Gotta Go Fast. It gives you a lot of mana generation, and mana is often the hardest thing for Velkoz to come by, so make sure to give him things like that or infusion. That blue buff is really important instead of the Shojin to get that fast cast. In general, Shojin's a lot weaker right now since they nerfed it to give you a little bit less starting mana, and that as a result makes Shojin a lot weaker compared to the fast cast of sorcerers. You gotta think about sorcerers as kind of being a fast composition. They don't want fights to drag out very long. That is why things like Archangel Staff is not particularly very good on Silco. No, because you want to burst very quickly, and when you kill them, they damage another enemy with an explosion of their body. Yeah, very gruesome. AKA, by the time this Archangel Staff equals a death cap in terms of the amount of AP you get, it's too late. Not to mention, you already get a bunch of flat AP anyways, so you might as well just go for big burst like Jewel Gauntlet instead. It is important that you find multiple ways to carry instead of just relying on Velkoz. If you can get Silco, he is very consistent as well, so you can give him things like Blue Buff, JG, and Morello, so you can get that application of anti-heal. And Ahri, what can I say about Ahri? Well, she's not only insane with all these items like Blue Buff, JG, and things like that on her, but she's also bananas if you give her things like Mana Zane, DFG, and Sniper's Focus. Just really strong at nuking the entire board. These items, by the way, are also particularly good on Velkoz, so if you wanted to take off these Velkoz items and just put this straight up on VK, it actually also works. Another thing I want to say is that this multicaster from Sona is really important, but it could be any multicaster. It could be Taliyah, it could be Twisted Fate, and you really want to just make sure that you have the multicaster for Velkoz if you chase him for 3-star. If you do end up playing just 6 sorcerers without playing Velkoz 3, let's say this is just Velkoz 2, and a lot of times you end up just primary going for Silco and Ahri, and eventually you move these items to Ahri, and you're not prioritizing Twisted Fate at all. Instead, you're trying to go for a front line that can help withstand a lot of damage. You end up going Shen, Jarvan, Taric, Swain, and sometimes you even see like an additional frontline unit. So you end up playing like, I don't know, an Aatrox or something. It's entirely possible that your 6 Sorks looks kind of like a Azir Silco setup, which is just like you just have 3 backliners and a bunch of frontliners. Top end for this composition is if you just hit RE2, that's good enough to win. Sorcerers are so good right now. And also, if you find a way to get to 8 Sorcerer, all you need is +1, and then you just like get to 8 and you play Orianna and you just have it. Like in this case, there's a Sorcerer Heart, so let me just wipe that. But if you notice that you're able to just get 8 Sorcerers on 8, you can play something like this as well. So I ended up actually talking about a standard Sorks comp instead of a reroll comp, but just to show you the variations that you can play, you can choose to go to 8 to play something like 8 Sorcerer, or, you know, reduce the amount and play more supportive units like the Shen and that Jarvan, cut 2 Sorks instead. You can do something like this, or you can choose to just roll for Velkoz 3 instead and just call it a day. Either way, Sorks are one of the best comps currently playing the patch, so definitely jam that whenever you have a chance to. A lot of times the reason why people don't go for Velkoz 3 is because there's multiple Sorks players in the lobby, and remember, only 18 copies of Velkoz are in the pool, meaning that if one person has Velkoz 3, only one other person can hit Velkoz 3 if no other Velkozes are taken out. A lot of times when you play Sorks, you're trying to go for a Void core and you have like the sorcerers there. If you do find Velkoz, you have an opportunity to go for 4 Sork on 5, which is actually very, very nice if you find things like that Swain. Taric is often what you roll for at 6. And the thing about Sorks is you really want to roll or 6 Sorks on 6 if you get a Sork emblem. Because if you get it on Kassadin, for example, this is the best possible level 6 board you can make, especially if you get Velkoz 2 and you get items on him. Insane power, you're going to streak all the way until stage 4 easily. And then at 7, you look for Silco, and if you can, find Silco 2. It's very, very hard to find Silco 2 these days because he's contested in a lot of different comps, but usually replace Orianna and you keep this core. And a lot of times you end up just playing this for a while you're finding extra copies of Jarvan and you're going for things like Shen. If you do find Shen too, just cut the Kassadin. It's not that important, and just get the Sorcerer Emblem on Shen. If you find Jarvan too, get that Sorcerer Emblem on Jarvan and play that instead. And you can play that Kassadin right back in so that you can have a little bit more frontline. And then at 8, hit that Ahri, play that legendary you want, like Scion or Heimerdinger or whatever, and just go to down. All right, time for some bonus comps. A lot of people always ask, where are hero augments currently slated? Are they good enough to play? And the answer is yes, and I'm going to cover a few of them very quickly. We'll start off with the Boss. Boss with Sett is currently the strongest hero augment in my opinion to play because it's offering 2 ways that you can go about it. The first is what I put on my priority list, which is you slam Sett items, you reroll him, and you add Juggernauts, and then you see Sett land a very comfortable top 2, top 3. The other is to use Sett 2 to tempo to get to a last level 8, play around Ionia, get things like items on Xayah and whatnot, and then cruise to an easy victory once you add enough Juggernauts. So experiment, give it a try, and let me know. I put a couple of different items of Sett that you could play on the Orns as well. Death Defiance and Hull Crusher are items that you could theoretically play. The usuals is Hand of Justice and maybe even a Titan. So you can have Sett have a very strong build to heal, crit, and deal a lot of damage. Shout out to Slogosong, by the way. I pulled most of these from his tier list as a way to show you guys how a lot of top level players are also approaching things like hero augment rerolls. Galio with Winds of War. Winds of War is actually surprisingly really good, but you need 2 things. One, you need to have a good Demacia start so you can have a way to snowball your league because you don't want to play from behind. And the other is you want to have a belt start so you can make things like that Warmogs. If you can't make that Warmogs and you don't have the belt start early, it's actually really hard to get Galio online. If you do though, let's say you start off with Poppy 2 and a Galio and you get that Warmogs, it's really, really good. But I'm not going to go that much in depth, so definitely explore it for yourself. Just remember, get 3 Demacia, get Galio, then slowly, after you hit KO 3, Galio 3, add Demacias and find that Invokers for Shen. I would probably say that this is A tier right now, currently. Definitely very fun, and the top end is pretty strong if you're able to get everything online. Riftwalker is also very good. I'd probably put him in A tier. The Boss is S tier, and Winds of War is probably A tier as well. I think Kassadin comes in as 3rd place, largely due to how big the gap is between 2-star Kassadin and 3-star Kassadin. 3-star Kassadin is actually really difficult to deal with, especially when you get everything online, and I do recommend some healing augments that are really powerful on him as well. I played a game, for example, with Rejuvenating Flames, and instead of Silco, I prioritized playing around the Ishtal, so I played like Milio and then added in like a different invoker, so 4 invoker. This is a possible way that you can actually play it and really make Kassadin pop off. Make sure you get Jewel Gauntlet on him and Hodge, because with Riftwalk, you get scaling AP every single time you cast. And so that means that Kassadin has infinite death caps. So just make that AP crit and add that Jewel Gauntlet on top of him to really burst. You don't need Bloodthirster. Double healing is really nice, so you can often instead go for something like Quicksilver, or perhaps my favorite new item, Night Harvester on Kassadin. Very, very good on him. in particular when he gets to that backline and gets below that 60% threshold HP. 6 Bastion is the key, but sometimes you can win with 4. I do personally believe 6 Bastion is very, very good, especially via Kassadin. But let's say if you don't have Kassadin and you have Poppy instead, sometimes you end up cutting these two to play better units. Roll for Kassadin 3 at 6 because your best odds at 40%, and then go for more Bastions. Ravenous under Warwick is still very, very good in the meta game, and I anticipate to still be an S tier and one of the top comps and rerolls to play if you do get to start. The best on mod is Robotic Arms. That way you can get Warwick to attack a lot and scale his Rage Blade. However, with Warwick, you need 3 specific items. You want Rage Blade, QSS, and Bloodthirster. If you don't have Bloodthirster, you can find other ways you can heal, like Hand of Justice, Gunblade, and some others, but they are way worse than Bloodthirster. And the reason is because the shield is very good that scales with Juggernauts to give that damage reduction. So make sure to try to get these 3 items if you can. However, you're sometimes in a situation where you are going to wait for a very long time to get this item, and the next time you can finish your 3rd item is stage 4. Instead, just slam things like a Hodge and don't greed for like a Bloodthirster instead. Make sure that tempo you get on 6 is really valuable because this Warwick can actually win streak for a long time. It's the same thing as usual. Just roll for it at level 6 and make sure you add more Juggernauts, ending in an Aatrox high with that Neferi. A lot of times people go challengers, not that important. You can play challengers in the mid game and dip out of it, but eventually you support with Silco and you get Neferi and Aatrox. The last hero augment I haven't covered is Swain, but in reality, Swain 3 is really impractical to get a lot of times. So if you pick Demon Flare, you're playing it for tempo into sorcerers. If you do end up getting in a spot with Demon Flare, you're not going to realistically be able to hit Swain 3 because sorcerers want him, strategists want him. A lot of people just throw him in Noxus comps as well. So just be very mindful that if you do Demon Flare, you're likely just going to play it for a 2-star Swain early and then curve out to the normal comp that you want to play. The last bonus composition that we'll cover very briefly is Double Trouble Taliyah. Still very fun. I call it the bounce house because you have Taliyah and Nautilus and Sett and even Kassadin knocking people up. And as a result, Taliyah is doing big damage with her passive, which says anytime an enemy is knocked up, she just throws a boulder and then deals damage. So big damage comes out with Sett with specifically a spark with the shred and the vow, so you instantly cast, and Taliyah is doing a lot of damage. However, I will say that if you don't play this comp without Double Trouble, it's actually a lot worse. So try not to do it just because you have 2 health or something like that. Because you have Double Trouble, you actually don't really want flash stats. You want Jewel Gauntlet, and you can go for the crit build with Guard Breaker. And then this Gunblade is actually end up being quite important for Taliyah to heal that set. Don't over prioritize Nautilus and Kassadin. A lot of times your board ends up being Sett, Taliyah, and then 1 multicaster, and then something else. If you do end up getting multiple Nautilus, that ends up being pretty nice, but it's not a priority. Also, sometimes you can play Qiyana, because Qiyana also, believe it or not, has a knockup that people don't actually talk about. And so she's actually a good unit that can be a substitute for Nautilus or Kassadin if you're not hitting either of them. There you have it, all my reroll comps that I think are super popular and strong currently on the B patch of 1318. Let me know any of your techs and tricks in the comments below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.